Loki is one of Marvel's most iconic characters, a mainstay of comics, TV, and film for decades at this point. But how does Marvel manage to crank out version after version of this character so successfully? And how do any of them compare to the actual, real Loki of Norse mythology? Well, not real, but you know what I mean. Well, strap in, because in this video I'm going to talk a little about the various ways Marvel has adapted the classic character of Loki, what worked about these different versions, and the inherent difficulties of the task. And for a reason I'll reveal at the end of the video, we're going to be focusing primarily, though not entirely, on the version of Loki we see in the classic Marvel Legacy series Avengers: Earth's Mightiest Heroes. There's a lot to love about the portrayal of Loki in this show. He's conniving, brutal, and bloodthirsty, and when the wheel of fate turns against him, this Loki also gets pretty wretched. Unlike a more restrained personality like, say, Doctor Doom, this guy chews the scenery. He's all melodrama, everything's massive, both the wins and the losses. And even though Loki does take some pretty fat L's throughout the course of this show, he is a real threat and never quite ceases to be one. Despite his low lows, the EMH team really respected the deep villainy that Lokis often show, and indeed the entire first season is sort of a testament to this capacity for evil in Loki, writ large, because, spoiler alert I guess, he's the one pulling the strings behind nearly everything that happens.
You do not even begin to understand. I am responsible for everything.
Again, there is a lot to love about this version of Loki, to the point where many who've seen the show hold this to be their definitive interpretation of the character. The striking visual design, the dialogue which oozes a sense of medieval malice, and the way he can play Thor like a fiddle, initially at least, are all really interesting and effective qualities which work in EMH's favour. But fan favourite though he may be, he is not the original Loki, or even the original Marvel Loki, and I want to talk a little about this, because it's also true that there's a lot of interesting layers to this Loki when we're thinking about adaptation. First, and most obviously, there's the way that Loki's scheme, and indeed all of Season 1, functions as an extended adaptation of that first Avengers comic. It's not direct. The story of how EMH's team comes together has a lot of original elements, and pulls inspiration from other sources too, like the new Avengers books, but the show's writers are on the record saying that this origin, the original origin, was the main driving force behind the overall shape of Season 1. Like Issue 1 back in 1963, the show's action is incited by Loki. The impact of this trickster god and his machinations is faithfully preserved, as we find out in the big reveal in the season finale. The irony of Issue 1 is also preserved, because in Earth's Mightiest Heroes too, Loki brings about his own destruction. His actions unite the very heroes which will go on to cast him down. That's a key part of this character in Marvel's villainous interpretation of him, I think. Loki is a loser. It doesn't matter what throne he sits on, or which heroes he temporarily defeats, sooner or later he'll always come crashing back down. And in Earth's Mightiest Heroes, we see that in spades. So despite the wide and varied publication history of comic book Loki, I think we can say that generally the version of the character we see in this show is a faithful adaptation, bringing across a bunch of the best bits from medium to medium. But it's also a faithful Loki adaptation in another way, faithful to the mythic background that the comics themselves were built on, in a lot of ways, both obvious and less so. We'll get to the more conceptual stuff later, but for now I'll just point out some of the easier mythological links to establish. For one, after Loki's defeated, EMH sees him imprisoned in a fairly odd way, bound tight with a venomous serpent above him, dripping scalding venom onto his face. This is actually an image taken almost directly from Norse mythology, as a very similar episode appears in the Eddas. There are differences, certainly. Originally it's a cave, not Yggdrasil, and most of the venom is caught by Loki's wife in a handy little bowl. But Earth's Mightiest Hero seems to be familiar even with details like this. The way Amora temporarily ceases the venom torture in the episode Powerless feels like an intentional spin on the mythic detail of Loki's wife and her bowl. And it looks like the show's Asgard narrative was building to another big mythologically influenced climax before it got cancelled, because, like I said, that Norse Loki was also tied up in a scene of near eternal torment. He doesn't break free until Ragnarok, and that's pretty clearly what was planned for this character in Season 3.
Ragnarok approaches. Soon, mortal and Asgardian alike shall succumb to the flame.
So through his crucial role in forming the Avengers, and by extension bringing on his own defeat, as well as his general malignancy, his specific punishment, and the role the show was setting up for him at the forefront of Ragnarok, the end of the gods, I think we can safely say that not only is this Loki a great version of the character, but that he's also a kind of accurate one. Now, I've talked a little previously about the impossibility of any truly faithful adaptation of a major comic book character, given the mass of often significantly different interpretations furnished by decades of comic book appearances, but honestly, this Loki is more or less the closest to faithful it's possible to get in a project like Earth's Mightiest Heroes. So if this is an accurate adaptation, does that mean that the other major Loki of the 2010s, the very different version we see in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is not? Well, it might seem so at first, but given the complexities of adapting such a proliferous comic book character, one whose roots lie hundreds of years further back still, I don't think it's that simple. For one, let's not forget that before his hero turn, Tom Hiddleston's Loki started out with a much more similar disposition to classic Loki, and indeed, his EMH counterpart.
I will be true heir to the throne.
You can't kill an entire race.
Why not?
Loki in Thor 1 was malicious, manipulative, and ruthless, using his silver tongue to persuade Thor to attack Jotunheim on the eve of his coronation in order to get the crown prince banished during the Odin sleep, then simultaneously usurping power and attempting to dispatch the Empire's greatest enemies in order to consolidate that power. That's a classic Loki scheme, every part as serpentine as, say, the Season 1 gambit in EMH. But in the Thor sequel and onwards, this side of the character diminished more and more with each appearance. I think the main reason for this change is Tom Hiddleston. He brought a humanity, a vulnerability to the character, which a lesser actor might not have been able to find, which in recent years has become something of a focal point for the character, culminating in his turn to comparative heroism in the recent Loki series. Is this some big departure then? Well, kinda, but also not really. Let's not forget Loki's showstopper role in the first Avengers film, which is in a lot of ways closer to the character's Silver Age story than EMH ever was. But more to the point, there's plenty of comic book precedent for this sort of Loki redemption arc, albeit mostly more recent stuff. After Siege and Dark Reign wrapped up a little over a decade ago, 616 Loki went through a sort of rebirth, first as Kid Loki, and then, well, things get weird again quickly, but the key point is that from around 2010 onward, Loki starts to help as much as he hinders. And this is a shift which began before MCU Loki even showed up. So in its own way, this too is a faithful adaptation, and a very successful one. Nowadays we tend to take that latter point for granted, but we really shouldn't, because the MCU, and the Thor franchise particularly, produced some really underwhelming villains. Hiddleston's Loki, though, remains one of the most captivating characters this franchise has produced, full stop. So if both Lokis are solid adaptations of their comic book precedents, despite going in wildly different directions, which one is more reflective of the ancient myths? The original Loki? Surely one has to beat the other in this regard, right? You'd think so, but you'd be wrong. Because the mythological Loki, as it turns out, is even less defined than his Marvel counterpart. He helps the gods and hinders them in equal measure. For instance, Loki famously kidnapped the goddess Eden, a crime for which the gods threaten him with death, but Loki only did that after being threatened by a giant, and after kidnapping Eden, he then goes back and rescues her. Another time, when a giant, Skadi, came to Asgard, threatening death and destruction, it's Loki who appeases her by making her laugh, saving the Aesir. Conversely, though, he kills Balder, the golden boy of Asgard, and when Ragnarok rolls around, he's on the side of the giants. So why is this? It's important to remember that there wasn't some character bible of Norse mythology, maintained by some proto-Germanic Kevin Feige. Hell, there wasn't even an understanding of character or interiority in the modern sense. No, the stories of Loki which have survived are the products of generations of different storytellers, so it would be kind of weird if the resulting picture of Loki was a wholly consistent one. That being said, Loki, more so than any other figure in these stories, defies simple classification, and not just because of the way he seems to flit between the side of the gods and the side of their enemies. No, it goes deeper. If you look outside the Eddas to other medieval sources, it seems people weren't even in agreement over what Loki was. Saxo Grammaticus's History of the Danes recounts an episode whereby Thor runs across a giant in Jotunheim called Utgarda Loki, who's imprisoned in an identical way to how Loki is in the more well-known myth mentioned earlier. tied to a rock with a venomous serpent dripping poison upon him. But Wildcard Loki isn't a god, he's a giant like any other. So if we look to the folklore and the mythology at the root of the Loki character, people couldn't even agree on what he was, let alone whether he was ultimately good or evil. And similarly, modern scholars can't even agree on the etymology of the name Loki. We don't even know what this name means. So in nearly every way, mythologically speaking, Loki is unknowable. Loki is contradiction. The tales from the sources like the poetic and prose Eddas, but also on a metatextual level. He's good and evil, an aid and a nuisance, a god and not a god. We don't know this character. We can't know this character. We can't even know what the word Loki referred to. In many ways then, the Loki of myth is an archetypal wildcard.
Guys, why aren't the brakes working?
Because I cut the brakes! Wildcard, bitches! Yeah!
What?
Returning to Marvel then, I think we can honestly call either of these versions good adaptations. Both MCU Loki and EMH Loki, even 616 comic Loki, all of these do justice to the original stories. Because all of these Lokis reflect the essentially variable and protean quality we see in the surviving Norse representations of this trickster, this hero/villain, god/giant figure. It isn't just that these Marvel Lokis are different from one another either, because each one of these versions undergo big changes, embracing this wildcard energy. It's maybe most obvious in the ways that 616 Loki and MCU Loki both at one point abandon their villainous ways, becoming bona fide heroes, but I think we also see a similar variability in the Loki of Earth's mightiest heroes. This variability can be seen in the way he is at various points a disguised figure pulling the strings, a battle leader of the Frost Giants, a mighty king of Asgard, and a lowly imprisoned wretch. This idea of Loki as the archetypal wildcard, at his core an unpredictable figure who has been many different things, is often lost when people try to compare these modern Lokis against their mythological forerunner, but I think it's a quality worth keeping in mind when we think about Loki. And however else we feel about these characters, these versions, I believe it shows that Marvel has largely succeeded with their process of adaptation. Be it Kirby's Silver Age trickster god, the alternately mighty and wretched villain of Earth's mightiest heroes, or the ultimately human redemption story we see at the core of Tom Hiddleston's interpretation of the character, these characters are all fundamentally Loki. And that's that. That's the Loki video, everybody. Thanks for checking it out, and I hope you enjoyed it. But before you go, the reason I was so eager to talk about the Loki from Earth's Mightiest Heroes is that coming up in May, there's another Twitter trend event planned to try and convince Marvel to consider bringing back this show, and maybe even other related projects. With the revival of X-Men 97, this is no longer a pipe dream. It's a serious possibility, and many of my longtime viewers are ardent supporters of this revival effort, so I'm trying to highlight it as much as I can. With that goal in mind, I'd like to announce a little project I'm putting together: Earth's Mightiest Playlist. Essentially, a week before the trend event takes place on the 21st of May, I'll be publishing a playlist of videos on the show, Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. And this playlist is going to be collaborative, so there'll be one or two of my videos in there, but also videos made by other creators on the same topic, all in an attempt to generate hype for the trend event. I know some creators in my community are already working on videos with the playlist in mind, and I'm going to be reaching out to a couple of larger creators too. But if you have a take, a theory, a video essay idea for this show that you've thought about making, then make a video over the next month or so and reach out to me via email or Twitter. I'm at PillarGarbage, or Discord, and I'll put your video in the playlist too. I can't guarantee you'll get thousands and thousands of views from it, but if we all work together to generate hype for this next trend event, we maximize the chance Marvel sees how many people loved these shows and want them back. So yeah, make a video, set it to public around the 14th of May, and send me a link, and I'll put it in Earth's Mightiest Playlist. And in case you're wondering, yep, I've nicked this idea from Nando V Movies. But that's it from me for now, so drop a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more similar stuff soon, and send me your videos for the playlist. If you want to read up a little more on the Norse mythology stuff I talked about in this video, I'll put a few links in the description. And as always, I'd like to end by thanking all my patrons on screen now, especially Kevin Douglas and Ian Fifield.